Have you ever wondered how a tragic crime led to groundbreaking legislation? Let's explore the case of Jacob Wetterling.
Hi, I'm Leah, feeling a bit reflective today and eager to dive into today's topic.
And I'm Garrett, excited to uncover the layers of this intriguing case. Welcome to Laid Back Learning with Leah and Garrett.
Today we're talking about the kidnapping and murder of Jacob Wetterling, an 11-year-old from St. Joseph, Minnesota, whose case reshaped how the U.S. handles sex offender registration and public safety. I remember reading about Jacob Wetterling and how it transformed how communities think about child safety. It really struck a chord with me because, bike rides to the store felt so normal growing up. The idea that one night could ripple across decades of policy and awareness is like heartbreaking and powerful at the same time. It made me think about how families and neighborhoods pull together when something unthinkable happens.
So, big picture to start. Kidnapping is when someone is taken or held against their will, and in U.S. history it's a crime that triggers massive responses because of the immediate danger to the victim. In Jacob's case, it overlapped with sexual violence, which adds another layer of legal and investigative urgency. And the implications went far beyond one investigation, changing how we track people convicted of sex crimes after they leave prison.
This case sits at the intersection of child abduction and sex crimes, which meant families across Minnesota and the country started asking different questions about prevention. Think of it like a stone dropped into a lake. The first splash is the crime itself, but the policy and public awareness are the ripples moving outward for years. Those ripples included better tools for law enforcement and more community education on who commits these crimes and how they operate.
And when people mention the ripple effect here, they often mean legislation like the Jacob Wetterling Act, which set the baseline for sex offender registries in the U.S. We'll get to that. But first, the human story matters. An 11-year-old boy, a small town, and a crime that changed how parents tuck their kids in at night. That's the weight we're carrying into the details.
All right, let's set the scene for October 1989 in St. Joseph, Minnesota. Jacob Wetterling is biking home with his brother Trevor and their friend Aaron Larson after a quick trip to a convenience store. It's a dark, quiet road, and a masked man steps out with a handgun and takes control of the situation fast. He orders the boys to throw their bikes into a ditch and lie face down, asks their ages, checks their faces, then tells Trevor and Aaron to run and not look back while he takes Jacob.
The description of the mask, a stocking cap pulled over his face, matters because it limited what anyone could identify. In a rural area at night, anonymity is like a terrible advantage for a perpetrator. The boys had the voice, the general build, and the sequence of commands. That's it.
The response kicked in immediately, with local police, the FBI, and even the National Guard joining the search. Volunteers canvassed, tips poured in, and a community support effort took shape alongside the Wetterling family's advocacy. The scale was enormous, yet the trail was thin. There just wasn't much physical evidence to anchor an early break.
That early lack of evidence is honestly what made the case so hard. No license plate caught, no clear face, and the location itself didn't offer many forensic breadcrumbs. Investigators were staring at thousands of tips and few verifiable leads. And the longer it stretched, the harder it got to separate promising information from pure noise.
Meanwhile, the Wetterling family and friends built outreach infrastructure because waiting in silence wasn't an option. The Friends of Jacob effort and, soon after, the Jacob Wetterling Foundation kept the focus on safety education and the search for answers. That energy helped sustain the case in the public eye over decades.
But in the days after the abduction, there was still no resolution, and fear spread fast in nearby towns. Parents changed routines. Kids who used to bike freely got rides instead. It's tough to overstate how much one incident can reshape daily life in a small community.
Let's turn to a name that surfaced early, Danny James Heinrich. He was questioned by the FBI in December 1989, and he provided a DNA sample, but at that time investigators didn't have the evidence they needed to charge him. person of interest here means someone believed to have information, not necessarily a person who can be arrested right away.
For years, Heinrich stayed on the radar, but nothing stuck legally. Technology just wasn't where it would be decades later. Forensic DNA matching, which is comparing genetic profiles from evidence to known samples, kept improving over time. The case, you might say, was waiting for science to catch up.
Then, in 2015, investigators got a major break. DNA from a separate case matched Heinrich. That earlier case was the January 1989 kidnapping and sexual assault of Jared Shirel, who was 12 at the time and taken in Cold Spring, about 10 miles from Jacob's abduction site. Jared's courage in telling his story and preserving evidence turned out to be critical.
Here's the twist. Even with that DNA match, Minnesota's statute of limitations, basically a legal deadline for bringing charges, had expired for the 1989 kidnapping of Jared, so prosecutors couldn't charge Heinrich for that specific assault. It's wild how that works. The evidence was powerful, but the clock had run out legally.
Investigators pivoted. They obtained a search warrant and found child sexual abuse material at Heinrich's home in October 2015. Child sexual abuse material, often shortened to CSAM, means illegal content depicting the exploitation of minors. That discovery led to 25 federal charges and gave prosecutors real leverage while still pursuing answers about Jacob.
Leverage is the key word. When you can't bring one charge because of timing, you move on what you can. The Sam case kept Heinrich in custody and opened the door to negotiation. It set the stage for the plea agreement that would finally reveal what happened to Jacob.
Under that plea deal, Heinrich agreed to plead guilty to one federal count related to the CSAM, and in return he would lead authorities to Jacob's remains and give a full confession about the abduction, assault, and murder. The goal was truth and recovery. It traded the uncertainty of a decades-old murder prosecution for sworn details and a chance to bring Jacob home. It's a difficult bargain, but it answered questions that had haunted a family and a state.
In September 2016, Heinrich took investigators to a pasture near Painesville, about 30 miles from the abduction site and close to where he lived in 1989. The Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension recovered human remains and clothing there. 2 days later, dental records confirmed the remains were Jacob's.
In a federal courtroom in September 2016 before Judge John Tunheim, a U.S. District Court judge, Heinrich gave a sworn account of kidnapping Jacob, handcuffing him, sexually assaulting him, killing him later that night, and burying the body. He also admitted to abducting and assaulting Jared Shirel in January 1989. He said he used a police scanner to avoid roadblocks that night and returned about a year later to move Jacob's remains when he saw a jacket had become exposed.
The sentencing came in November 2016, 20 years in federal prison, the maximum for that single count. The court acknowledged the broader harm of his admitted actions, and Judge Tunheim noted Heinrich could face civil commitment after his sentence. That's a legal process that can keep someone confined if they're deemed sexually dangerous. In other words, the formal conviction was for CSAM, but the outcome aimed at long-term public safety, given the gravity of what he confessed.
For Jacob's family, the recovery of his remains meant an end to decades of uncertainty. Patty Wetterling's statement at the time captured both heartbreak and relief. The community also carried the weight of knowing how close to home it all was. Painesville wasn't far, and the place chosen was familiar to the perpetrator. In the wake of the recovery, the focus widened again to prevention and how to honor Jacob's memory.
Okay, controversial thread here. The Painesville area saw a series of assaults on teenage boys between 1986 and 1987. Investigators revisited those cases in 2014 with help from Joy Baker. She's a citizen investigator and writer who connected dots and nudged law enforcement to take another look. I think the similarities in method and geography suggest a strong likelihood those incidents are linked to Heinrich.
I hear you, and those similarities are hard to ignore. Nighttime attacks, teenage boys, threats with a weapon, that cluster around Painesville. But I'm cautious. There was no formal adjudication tying Heinrich to those mid-1980s assaults. Without charges or a court finding, It sits as an investigative belief rather than a legal conclusion, and that distinction matters.
Totally fair. Belief is not proof. Still, the pattern perspective can be useful for prevention. If multiple events show the same behavior, you can shape patrols and public alerts more effectively. That's where Joy Baker's work feels important. Reframing scattered reports as a possible series can change investigative priorities.
Agreed on the prevention value. I'm just mindful of not overreaching. Given the stakes, we want to be careful with attribution. But if those earlier cases are connected, it underscores how serial behavior can simmer under the surface when early tips or patterns don't get fully developed.
Which raises a question. Why didn't those Painesville cases lock in a suspect back then? I mean, was it resources, technology, or just the difficulty of nighttime eyewitness ID? If DNA or lead tracking systems had been where they are now, maybe that series gets cracked sooner.
Probably some of all three. The late 1980s weren't today in terms of databases, interagency coordination, or even public awareness of grooming and offender patterns. And missed leads can compound over time. Once a crucial thread drops, the next steps get foggy. That's not an excuse. It's a reminder that systems matter for justice.
Speaking of systems, the pop culture lens really spotlighted this. In the Dark, a podcast by American Public Media devoted an entire season to the Wetterling case. They highlighted investigative gaps in the Stearns County Sheriff's Office, like lead management and follow-up. That kind of reporting can push institutions to reassess and improve, which honestly is pretty valuable.
And locally, there's the Bridge of Hope near St. Cloud. It's a Mississippi River crossing named in Jacob's honor. It serves as a memorial and a symbol of resilience, a physical reminder that communities can grieve, remember, and keep working to protect kids. That's close to the heart of this story.
Let's do a what-if scenario. What if the statute of limitations hadn't expired on the 1989 kidnapping and assault of Jared Shirel? With a chargeable case in hand after the 2015 DNA match, prosecutors might have directly charged Heinrich and pushed for a plea that included Jacob's case even sooner. That could have meant earlier answers for the Wetterlings and possibly different investigative momentum in the 2000s, not the 2010s.
And if he'd faced the Shirel charge earlier, that leverage might have compelled a confession or at least a negotiated path to Jacob's remains long before 2016. On the other hand, even with charges, there's no guarantee a defendant cooperates. People make unpredictable choices. But the realistic takeaway is that legal timelines shape strategy as much as evidence does.
Right. It shows how prosecutors sometimes have to get creative. If door A is locked, try door B. In this case, federal CSAM charges became the path to truth. Not ideal in theory, but it worked in practice. That's something to chew on, huh?
Stay curious and kind. I'm Leah, and I'm grateful we could bring some clarity to a story that still resonates.
And I'm Garrett. Keep asking why and keep learning. So there we have it. Time to put a bow on that.